Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Read the Care Tag, a fashion podcast. Today, we will be diving into the little-known illicit fashion subculture of mid-century Soviet Russia, Stilyagi. This podcast is about anything and everything fashion-related, for all of those who never grew out of playing dress-up. With a sprinkle of history, a dabble of pop culture, a healthy dollop of fashion obsession, and a pinch of philosophical questioning. I hope you enjoy the show. My name is Maya, and today's episode is a dive into a little-known subculture in the history of Soviet fashion. Now I know what you're thinking. Soviet Russia? Gray and brown-clad comrades smoking cigarettes and chugging vodka, plodding through their desaturated lives is what comes to mind, not rebellious fashion subcultures. Well, despite the classic Cold War portrayal of the drab USSR, not everyone followed the Sovietsky rules. Today, we'll be focusing on the Stilyagi subculture that lasted from the 1940s to the 1960s, which emerged during the post-war era. As we have discussed in past episodes, just like social movements, fashion movements tend to emerge from the context of the environment. After the hard years during the war, as well as when many young men returned from overseas military service, many youths had their rose-tinted communism glasses shattered. In fact, it was particularly crucial the return of these overseas soldiers. They had gotten to know what it was like za granice, outside of Russia, beyond the borders. And as the Stilyagi movement started, it was giving jazz, zoot suits, and dandies turned up to 100, a full-on caricature of what Soviet youth viewed America as. The limited overseas media they had absorbed had given the early Stilyagi a hyper-pigmented and exaggerated view of what Western life was like, and they loved it. As the culture began to pick up steam, the look evolved into a rockabilly-esque silhouette with slim, long pants, platform brothel creepers, oversized jackets, and extravagant hairstyles. Now, just a quick note, for those of you listening to audio only, if you join me on YouTube at Read the Care Tag, a fashion podcast, you'll get to see what exactly I'm talking about as I go. Or you can also check the podcast out on Instagram at Read the Care Tag, where I'll be posting some of the things I talk about as well. Now, as fun as these styles look, in the Soviet Union, living the Stylyaga lifestyle was literally risking your life. During Stalin's rule, all foreign imports were strictly forbidden, including fashion. Now, that also includes fashion imagery, fashion magazines, anything. The fashion of the citizens of the USSR was largely determined by the scarcity of diverse style, not by personal choice. Even things like nylons were considered a luxury. Now, you might be curious as to why I have such a flawless Russian accent. Well, in fact, my own parents grew up in the Soviet Union, and my mom has told me stories of dyeing her stockings a faded lavender blue just for the sake of a little self-expression in a world of strict uniform. Anytime an item of quality or interest appeared, queues of hopefuls would fill the streets around the lucky store, which would slowly disperse after the stock was exhausted. At the same time, excessive fashion expression was severely mocked, and police, as well as youth patrols, would seriously hurt a lone stylyaga and rip their clothes or shave their heads. The term Stilyagi, which is a plural of stylyaga, is a colloquialized derogatory term for fashion, style, hunters, whose vapid obsession with their clothes was a caricature of all that was wrong with Western culture to the moral proletariat of the Soviet Union. Our instinct might be to view the subculture in a political context as a rebellion against the Soviet ideology and communism, or a pro-Western movement. In fact, it was actually quite apolitical. The movement was much more of an escapist, make-believe, vibrant world full of music, magic, and the costumes to go with it. It was also much more fun than the alternative. Most Russian youth were strongly encouraged to join Komsomol, basically youth club for communists. One of their main activities was in fact terrorizing the Stilyagi and trying to break up their parties, which the Stilyagi held in illegal speakeasy venues playing American music smuggled in on X-ray records. Now, these records were nicknamed bone music, with illicit notes hidden in the bone scans of good Soviet citizens. Funnily enough, jazz music used to be encouraged in pre-war USSR, because the popular styles of the early 20th century jazz were much more rigid and formal. But as jazz moved towards free-form improvisation and experimental styles, it was banned for its endorsement of individualism. Both saxophones and six-string guitars were banned as well. This meant that if Komsomol came to crash your jazz party and you had some illicit instruments, that could lead to some serious consequences. Distribution of bone records, for example, carried charges of privateering and hard prison labor. Bone records, or muzyka na ryobrach, meaning music on the ribs, are incredible in and of themselves. Essentially, savvy Stilyagi or general black market hooligans would hospital dumpster dive for some discarded X-ray film, or find a connection on the inside to buy them from. It really was a matter of scale. If you're a kid who wants to listen to Elvis and the Beach Boys, you might go the medical trash diva route. But if you're a black market dealer looking to sell records on a larger scale, you would seek a plug. Then, the stolen X-rays would be cut into 7-inch discs and center holes would be burned through with a cigarette. According to Russian rock journalist Artyom Trotsky, quote, "Grooves were cut at 78 RPM with the help of special machines, made, they say, from old phonographs by skilled conspiratorial hands. The quality was awful, but the price was low, a ruble or a ruble and a half. The discs could be played 5 to 10 times. It's insane to think the lengths that people would go to just to listen to a little music. All that trouble for a record that could only be played a handful of times. Now that we know the context of the Stilyagi subculture in mid-century Soviet Russia, let's talk about their style. Just kidding, before we talk about their style and fashion, let's talk about how they talk. Stilyagi developed their own slang to distinguish themselves from the regular Soviet citizen. Where most people would call each other tavarish, meaning comrade, Stilyagi would say chuvak, which basically means guy or dude. In both Moscow and Leningrad, where there was a particularly large subset of Stilyagi youth, they would refer to the main streets of each respective city as Broadway, although they Russified it and called it Brod. Funnily enough, they never really referred to themselves as Stilyagi, even though that's what we know them as today. It was instead a term coined by press cartoons ridiculing them for their fashion obsession. In the words of a satirical article published in the Crocodile magazine in 1949, quote, "A young man appeared in the doorway. He had the most absurd appearance. The back of his coat was bright orange, while the sleeves and tails were green. I have never seen such broad canary yellow and pea green pants, not even during the reign of the famous flared trousers. His boots were a cunning combination of black patent leather and red suede. The young man leaned against the doorframe and in an extraordinarily cheeky gesture threw his right leg over his left, revealing his socks, whose brightness was blinding." Stilyagi even gained a particularly affected manner of walking, talking, and flinging their hair around to exude their bohemian nature. Now, I know, you came here for the fashion and not for the drama, so let's get into what they wore. The men, they started with the hair and grooming. Waxed up pompadours and thin mustaches reigned supreme. And in the early years of the movement, Stilyagi wore wide pants and bright tops, often homemade, combined with homemade brothel creeper shoes. Now, if you listened to the last episode, you might remember that we mentioned brothel creeper shoes. In the last episode, we talked about the styles carried in Vivienne Westwood's and Malcolm McLaren's shop, Let It Rock, which embraced the teddy boy styles of the 40s to 60s rock and roll subculture. We also talked about how these shoes emerged from post-war British youths returning from the war with their large sole crepe boots. These boots became stylish and slowly evolved into loafer dress shoe styles with chunky crepe soles in bright colors and textures. We also discussed how this style returned in the 2010s with Fenty Puma creepers that barely changed from those rock and roll British shoes. Well, here, creepers strike once again. With the rebellious youth's obsession with rock and roll, the few images and magazines they did receive from overseas were filled with rock bands wearing the same sort of extreme styles as those carried in the early days of the Let It Rock shop. Stilyagi, however, were forced to go for the homemade version. Later on, the trousers became slimmer, and the double-breasted jackets were paired with Hawaiian shirts. They sported rock-inspired pompadours as they peacocked through USSR streets, reveling in the displeased stares their flamboyant ensembles pulled, feeling in their hearts that even the soberest Soviet citizen must crave a taste of their bright lives. But who were the Stilyagi? Although Stilyagi came from all different socioeconomic backgrounds, there were some mainstays that a group of Stilyagi practically couldn't exist without. First, there were the rebellious rich kids, whose parents might work in import-export, government officials, or remnants of the Russian Empire who managed to transition into the higher-ups of the Soviet Union. These positions allowed them access to American styles, illicit instruments, and forbidden literature and media. They bought the fancy cars, chic clothes, and had the connections within enforcement in order to avoid trouble, which helped to support and protect the Stilyagi culture. There were, of course, also people from the lower classes who saved their money in order to buy clothing from overseas tourists, or fartsovchiki, who were illegal traders that brought everything from jeans to records to saxophones. And although the discussion of Stilyagi often centers around men, it did not exclude women. There were women Stilyagi, however, they were less noticeable. Since women's fashion at the time was pretty strict in terms of dress skirt requirements, so it was difficult for them to wear exaggerated styles like male Stilyagi without risking serious harassment. Around the late 50s, though, women's fashion in Russia began to change. As part of the Soviet pretext to present the country as all happy and great, there was a House of Dyer fashion show in Moscow. And then fashion plates and magazines began to enter the mainstream. Interesting and colorful clothing was becoming more accessible as synthetic fabrics and dye became more and more the rage. The gal Stilyagi were called klevaya chuvicha, basically translating to sick chick. And this chuvicha, the feminine version of chuvak, began to experiment with home tailoring as well as buying from custom dressmakers in order to incorporate the Dyer new look silhouette into their style. It's hard to paint a static picture of Stilyagi. Just like any fashion, it changed with every season. As Mikhail German describes, the fops were no longer enamored of the capacious gabardine or covert cloth summer coats, either worn or thrown over the arm, which had previously been considered just as chic. Instead, they paraded around in check, knee-length raincoats, tied their neckties with microscopic knots, and even dared to sew tight trousers, which seemed slightly amusing, but also excruciatingly marvelous. And there were already flickers of blue pants with seams on the outside, as the irate old lady said. The first blue jeans. The naive paluboks remained the mainstay of the conservatives, but young men preferred to have their hair cut in Polish or Canadian style, as it was considered very modern to carry a zippered folder, a bootlicker, instead of a portfolio, and a plaid cowboy shirt of a special new cut. Even though many of these words may sound like gibberish, they're not really the point. They simply illustrate just how much the fashion changed throughout the years and how quickly styles were picked up and dropped. Similarly for women, change was nigh. With the 60s, there came an influx of the Twiggy-inspired round eyeliner, miniskirt, and cropped hair styles. Then, as the 70s rolled in, so did the wild girl, with billowing pants and the return of the creeper shoe. In a way, this exemplified the rebellious spirit of the Stilyagi. Both the men and women employed gender bending to rebel against societal sensitive tastes. It seemed, though, that despite all of these things, women Stilyagi were unable to develop their own definitive style. Personally, I blame this on the social culture of modesty and propriety that was prevalent both in the West and the East at this time, as well as it still is today. The idea that a rebelling youth is just a boy going through growing pains is not a new one. Plenty of the Stilyagi boys grew up and out of the style, and once their gelled locks were no more, they were welcomed back as a good Russian boy, ready to become a man. For women, not the same. A woman departing from the norm was seen as damaged goods. Even if she brushed out her teased hair and put her komsomol jacket right back on, the people would whisper. Even slight departures in makeup, accessories, or even diet could mark a woman as spoiled. This quote illustrates the perspective well. As if straight from a picture in a Western magazine, this woman exuded the stench of that decaying world where people know nothing of how to respect one another. No, this repellent way of painting one's face does not fit with our joyful, open-hearted, honest, good women. Now, the 60s, they were interesting. As the Soviet Union became unprecedentedly open, the Stilyagi were growing up. Now these adult Stilyagi brought their rebellious spirits into the raising of their children. The new Stilyagi were now obsessed with the Beatles. They called themselves Shtatniki, Shtaty meaning the States, with wide gray pantsuits and formal dress shoes paired with wild hairstyles and unruly mustaches. Then the eventual fall of the Union in the 90s shattered the curtain between the West and the East. No longer were the Stilyagi escaping Soviet standards. They were now just another subculture, and although the style continued to evolve, it was slowly replaced by the new punks. Stilyagi borrowed from teddy boys, zoot suits, rockers, and jazz musicians, and they were marked by an eclectic and wild abandon. They mixed and matched because rarely could they find sets, and instead they customized, throwing together pieces of overseas rags to create the ununiformable Stylyaga. Now, before I close out this episode, I want to share the conversation I had with my grandmother, who was growing up in Soviet Russia during the 50s and 60s. Although she was a little young to be part of the Stilyagi beginnings, her brother Nolya, who was 9 years older, was at the prime age for it. She mentions her brother rocking the magenta jackets and narrow pants while she was a teenager, as he was rip-roaring through his 20s. But in her memory, the Soviet shift, the great birth of the Stilyagi, came after the 1957 Sixth World Festival of Youth and Students, which was held in Moscow. As my grandmother describes, it felt like aliens were coming. Foreign people were exotic and magical, and they would get to walk among them. My grandmother was only 13 years old, and she told me how she still remembers running around with her pompadoured brother trying to exchange goods with tourists. Due to his dark coloring, and according to my grandma, pretty boy looks, he even managed to get into zones of the festival that were forbidden to Russian citizens because people assumed that with his flashy style and dark good looks, he must be Italian. Later, in the early 60s, Nolya was also a hockey referee, and because of that, was able to travel. Through those travels, he would buy a couple extra sets of whatever was in fashion and then sneak it back into the USSR to make a couple extra rubles, spreading them amongst the Fashionistas of Moscow. Even later on, when my grandma was already hard at work in the labor force, one of her coworkers would sell items from Zagranitsa, beyond the border, to make some extra money. She told me about a mohair scarf that she spent 50 rubles on, about half a month's salary, and she still has that scarf to this day. My grandmother thinks that the 57 festival is what opened the doors to all of these changes. Before that, the world outside of Russia seemed alien, scary, and bad. And while Russia was a place of buy what you can, get fabrics, and sew what you can, or go to a seamstress if you want anything beyond the simplest, blandest clothes, they wanted more. My grandmother, she was lucky. Her father worked as the manager of a distribution center, which distributed shoes to various stores. So through both that and his connections, she was lucky enough to get first pick of some of the stock and at least get some better quality items, even if they weren't very pretty. She tells me gleefully about the time she was in need of fabric to sew a coat. While looking through the fabrics, she saw an electric blue weave with a slightly hairy texture that she immediately snatched. Then her brother's wife gifted her some fox fur that she had managed to dig up, from which she had the collar of the coat and a matching hat made. My grandmother told me laughing how when she took the metro to work, people literally turned and stared at her vibrant ensemble. As we have seen, in Russia, it wasn't impossible to find the good stuff. It just wasn't easy. In the year leading up to the 1967 50th anniversary of Soviet rule and the Soviet Revolution, there were several new imports thrown into stores to appease the people. And just like everyone else, my grandma went to GUM, Главный универсальный магазин, or Main Universal Store, to see what there was to buy. As she gazed at the massive queues for the hottest new item, she wondered how she would get one. The line for bright-colored polo shirts was daunting, but she was determined to get one for her fiancé. The shirts were 18 rubles. Serious money, but my grandmother was serious too. The front of the line was blockaded off with large metal transport containers in order to keep out the line skippers. However, despite this, she managed to sneak her way through and get to the front of the line. Then she batted her lashes and asked the men at the front to please, pretty please, buy her a shirt. Luckily, they did. My grandmother was not rich and not really a Stylyaga, and she was, a regular person. More or less. And even in the drab and gray Sovietsky Soyuz, just like her, everyone was crazy for fashion. There are levels, of course, but the point I'm making is that the need for self-expression through our garb is intrinsic, and the proletariat of the USSR are no exception to this peculiarity of humanity. Through fashion, we are able to track the story of the people who wear those clothes, and the Stilyagi, just like any other fashion subculture, are a symptom of a social emotion whose seeds are not limited to just one single type of person. This subculture holds a special place in my heart. With immigrant parents from Russia and a rich well of stories of Soviet life from both them and my grandparents, these black and white photos are colorized in my eyes. When I was younger, I watched a 2000s film called Stilyagi, a Russian musical telling this same story through the lives of a group of Stilyagi. The music, the costumes, the characters, they brought this subculture to life. Stilyagi are unique. They arose in a particular place and a particular time as a symptom of their environment. They tried in all manner, from clothing to language, to live in the technicolor world of a Warholian print, and they never gave up. Sometimes fashion is a political statement, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's an expression of self, a cry out into the void, an armor to face the world. And the Stilyagi, they embraced and rejected every side of it. Thank you so much for joining me on Read the Care Tag. Follow the Instagram at Read the Care Tag for photos of the stuff that I talked about today. And please follow and review the show on Spotify or whatever platform you're listening on to let me know what you think of my rambling. The sources are linked in the description, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your week.